Why are we bad at making decisions? Well, I can tell you why I'm bad at making decisions, and that's because I get too emotional. My emotions make the decision for me, and that's a very bad way to make a decision. If you're too emotional when you come to decision making, you'll make decisions that reinforce the emotions that you have rather than reinforce your needs in terms of your objectives in life. So you need to develop objectives in life and then make decisions that support those objectives. Don't make decisions that support your emotions. And emotions are very deep. They can have an impact in your decision making that's far deeper than you think. Also, another thing that can happen, why I'm very bad at making decisions, is I have this problem where the minute I make a decision, I almost regret it instantly. I kind of have what I call mental paralleling, where I make a decision and then this parallel me seems to then go off into the other direction with me mentally that made the other decision. And of course, lo and behold, that person gets everything right and everything goes swimmingly well, and all the problems that occur on this line because of this decision wouldn't have happened if I'd taken that route. What nonsense. You've got to kill mental paralleling. Of course there would have been just as many problems on that route and more because you focused on this route. This is the one to focus on. Kill the mental paralleling, something that a lot of people do and they shouldn't do. So how are decisions made? Well, decisions are made at 4 levels. One is the individual, one is as a manager, one is in negotiation, and one is societal. Now, the individual, the problem we can have with making decisions individually or as an individual is emotions, as I've said. But as a manager, that can also get in the way. What can happen as you make decisions as a manager is you want to reinforce perhaps what you perceive as your weak authority. So that's again emotion coming into it. You perceive yourself as weak, you're trying to support that weak authority. That's preventing you making good decisions. Then there's negotiation. What are the problems when you make decisions in negotiation? Well, they're very win-lose based decisions. You're looking for a win, and therefore that means that somebody else has to lose. Now that can create very poor decisions, and it can create a lot of regret to your decisions as well, especially when perhaps other people lose and they don't want to lose. So you can have all sorts of problems in negotiation decisions as well. Lastly, there's societal. Well, societal actually brings a lot of prejudice with it. You have a lot of conditioning on your own views of society, your own values, which might be good or bad values, depending on how you view them and how other people view them. And so you're quite prejudiced. Everyone has a certain prejudice in terms of how they make decisions at a sort of societal level. So there's always problems in decision making, whether it's emotional or supporting what you perceive as your weaknesses, or whether it's a win-lose proposition, or whether it's your prejudice and values. There's always problems within decision making that you need to be aware of. So what should decision making avoid? Well, the key thing decision making should avoid is heuristics. What are heuristics? They're what's known as rules of thumb. One heuristic that is a common problem in decision making is what's known as the availability heuristic. We are much more focused on things that are apparent right next to us than we are on things that are not apparent next to us, or we perhaps can't see. For instance, if we're having to reduce the numbers of people in our department and we're having to decide between 2 people, one of them has to go, and the person that is in the office next to you, you're going to notice their faults and their attributes much more than you're going to notice the person in the office down the corridor. That's known as the availability heuristic. So you'll have a bias, either positively or negatively, towards the person that's right there than towards the person that you can't see that's down the corridor. And that's one aspect of decision making that we must be aware of in terms of bias that can be generated. Another aspect is what we call the representative heuristic, and this says that we may have some prejudice. We may think that, okay, people from country X believe in this particular way. We may look at that on a gender basis, on a class basis, on an ethnicity basis, or all sorts of reasons, on an age basis, a university basis, a football team supporting basis. There may be all sorts of reasons why we make assumptions in our decision making based on what's known as the representative heuristic, that person X comes from country Y, therefore they must be emotional, whatever. Another problem with heuristics may be the effect heuristic. Here This is what's known as having a sixth sense. People say, oh, I've got a funny feeling about this person, or I just don't like that person, that I can't put my finger on it. And it's that sixth sense. That's actually the effect heuristic. And what's happened is from conditioning, early life conditioning perhaps, or from meeting people that were a bit like this person, you've developed a prejudice and you're now slotting that person into that prejudice. And that's, again, a very poor way of making a decision. It's very judgmental and it's a very poor, it's not something that you should include in your decision making. And finally, there's something known as the non-rational escalation of commitment. This is where we throw good money after bad, if you like. What we've done is we've invested in something, we've taken it to a certain place, and we're now investing in it because we've previously invested in it. So it's throwing good money after bad. What we must realize is that that is a sunk cost. That cost has gone. Are we going to continue investing in it? Well, we can make a very good decision, a very rational decision that decides whether we're going to carry on investing in it based on our future objectives, not on what's happened in the past. So we mustn't escalate the commitment just because we've previously committed. So how should we make decisions? Well, the first thing we need to do is decide the decision that's to be made. What is the context of the decision? What are we trying to decide here? What's the outcome? What is the decision to be? So we need to really laser down the key question. We can even just write it down. What is the decision to be made? Because it may not be as clear as you think. The context for making that decision may also not be as clear as you think. What's the background to the decision? And finally, what's the criteria for making the decision? What's going to be the key criteria, the key elements that will decide on the decision we make? We then need to develop alternatives. Now, what's interesting here, we're not interested in quality at this moment. We're not in the quality of alternatives. We're interested in the number of alternatives. We need quantity. We need to throw it all in there. So it's a sort of corralling exercise in which all the potential alternatives, having framed the question, now let's look at all the alternatives. Numbers matter at this point. Just throw them in. There's no such thing as a bad alternative at this stage. They all can come in. Quantity is the key. And then the next stage, obviously, is evaluation. Once you've got all these alternatives, you then need to evaluate them. And what you then need to do is come up with some benchmarking. We talked about the criteria for making the decision. Well, we need to create some benchmarks on those criteria and then slot all these alternatives into those various benchmarks. What are the benchmarks for making the decision? How does each one of these alternatives fit with those benchmarks? Of course, avoid any prejudice, avoid any heuristic thinking. Those ways, at this stage, you can try and physically remove those heuristics. Once you've done that evaluation, once you've got all the different alternatives, you've run through the benchmarks, then you can then go back and say, is there any prejudice in here? Is there any heuristics in here? And remove those. So it becomes a very rational process. And then finally, you need to revert back to your long-term goals. What is the key goal you have over the long term? Not just step 1, but step 5 or 6. What's the key goal here? And then you'll probably have 4 or 5 potential alternatives in front of you. Look at the long-term goal. Which one gets you to that long-term goal? Not just to step 1, but to step 10. So that's the way to make the final decision. Anything else? Well, yes. 2 things. One is avoid groupthink. What do we mean by groupthink? Well, groupthink is where decisions are made potentially in groups where nobody wants to offend anybody else, and so there may be one person that comes up with a great idea and nobody else will attack it because they don't want to offend people. Probably the most famous bit of groupthink in history was the Japanese cabinet when it came up with the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Nobody wanted to offend anybody else. There was one person in the room that said, was gung-ho, let's go for it, and nobody wanted to say, actually, this is suicidal. And so they attacked Pearl Harbor, and the rest is history. The second thing to remember is Pareto's 80-20 law that basically says you should look for the thing that will give you 80% of what you need, 80% of the return for 20% of the effort. Every time you look at key decisions, somewhere in there will be the 80-20. There will be the 20% of the effort that will give you 80% of the result. And those are the things to look for. And then finally, if you're having trouble with a decision, think about using a decision tree. A decision tree is simply a tree that's been turned on its side and it has the key issue to be settled here and all the various permutations of decisions that can be made, and it will create an enormous number of options. What it will create on the right hand side is a series of numbers that will be the key criteria. Normally it's cost, but it can be time, or it can be something else, but each one of your permutations should end with the key criteria that you're using for your decision making, often cost or time, or whether it will meet your objectives, and put them down there in a line. So you'll have a whole series of valuations that have created a figure at the end that will allow you to evaluate against the criteria you originally set all the potential decisions you can make.